this is Chris Wistrom, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
So hello, welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. Tonight, or this morning, depending on when you're listening to it, we have a panel show for you. And the topic is how less is more. Joining me on the panel is Jay Hrcsko.
Hello.
And our first time participant, Chris Wistrom. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Jay, this show is really your idea. The three of us met up at Craig Larman's 3-day LeSS Masterclass. I suspect you had some ulterior motives, not only getting us back together, but like trying to refresh all the stuff that came at us in those 3 days.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. So, and to start, when we first sat in that class, and for those of you that are listening, this is the first time Andy and I actually met Chris. So this was really like a totally wild experience. When we first sat down in the class, the first thing Craig Larman says is, most of you are going to want to go back to your jobs and put together a presentation to explain this course, and you're not going to be able to do it, right? And when he said that the first morning, I was like, look at the ego on this guy. Like really, like he's teaching us like cold fusion and quantum computing, right? Like there's no way. And after 3 days, I totally agree. So to your point about my ulterior motive, I wanted to get the three of us together to talk about what we experienced, what we learned, what will we pass on to other people thinking about this course, because we might parlay this into a series of should I take this? Because there's so many Agile courses and certs out there. I think we're starting to put together a series of all the different classes. Should I take my Troy and I are working on one? Should I take the SAFe LPM course? Right. So that's where I want to have this conversation around not only what we learned, but for people who may be on the fence, maybe do I take this? Do I not? Which we're going to get into in a little bit. Nice. I think this would be very informative. So just to start, Andy, I don't want to get too far off your agenda because I think you put together a really good one. Let's go around the horn and let's just talk about why you took the class and if you had any experience with it beforehand. So I'll go first, right? So I took this class because obviously Craig Larman was teaching it, and he has a bit of reputation for speaking his mind. I watched a bunch of his videos on YouTube and his TED Talks or something like that, and I thought, this guy's going to call a spade, so I really want to hear what he has to say. Coupled with, I had no experience with LeSS whatsoever. I knew how to spell it, and I knew kind of sort of what it was, and everybody kept saying it was descaling. It was descaling, but what does that actually mean? And truth be told, I come from multiple SAFe shops. So this is almost and as I learned at the end of 3 days, almost the antithesis of what I'm typically doing. So it was really just a morbid curiosity about, if I've learned the SAFe monster, what's at the other end? And what does that word mean? And that's how I ended up in this course with the two of you. So how about you?
I'm really disappointed, Jay, because I thought, we were bouncing it back and forth, and you said, I'm going to go. Should we share a room?
Well,
I was like, I called Big Spoon, and you're like, I'm in.
That was the undocumented side benefit. That wasn't a bug. It was a feature. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Chris, I'm interested in what brought you to the class as well. And just in short, why'd you show up, and why are you on this podcast? Haven't you listened to any of us? Have you listened to our podcast before? You're a brave soul.
So I took the class because I think it was in 2017. I was at a Scrum gathering, and I attended one of Craig Larman's sessions. It was an hour session. We did the causal loop diagram about the one backlog and the one product owner, and I was sold from that moment, but I couldn't figure out how in the world this would actually work in an organization that, has a lot of products and works through a lot of different priorities. So I wanted to know more about that. I read a little bit on his website. He's got a pretty comprehensive website. So if you all haven't seen less.works, I would say go out there, check it out. There's a lot of good stuff out there. So I just took it for that reason. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know how I went in thinking I was going to sell it to the organization. And like you said, when he said at first, don't take this back to your organization and give them a recap, I was like, well, all right, why am I here?
Because that's what we do. We go off to a workshop and we come back and we debrief everybody. They're like,
Exactly.
great, can I get back to work and status quo?
Exactly.
And we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, but I thought it was a really good 3-day course, despite my misgivings after the first 5 minutes. It was really interesting, and I feel like I really got a lot out of it. And really, he did go into a lot of detail on how you can actually bring this to your organization, and it's not in the typical way that we usually do.
Yeah. My reasons were a multitude. Spending 3 days in a overnight with Jay was useful in a residence inn. That's always fun. I had seen Craig, maybe it was 2 years ago. He did a 1-hour prezzo. It was a meetup, and the way he handled a group of 50 people was amazing. And so one of the reasons I wanted to go was to see his facilitation technique. Another reason somebody said, oh, Larman, who's teaching, LeSS class, who's teaching Larman? Oh, be prepared for a plank contest and drinking at 3:00. And so that about sealed it for me. I'm like, great, I can go learn from the source, and there'll be beer at 3:00. I'm in. One of the things that I really liked, and we'll get into the actual content, but this is more of the meta stuff, the workshop format that he has put together and delivered so many times was really wonderful. As a facilitator, I would go between watching what he was doing and paying attention to the content. He had a masterful training from the back of the room, really great for adults for 3 days, just varying the way he was presenting materials and making it stick. I don't know if you guys noticed how frequently we would change body position. We would stand, we would sit, we would go to the board, we would draw, we would sit back down, we would write. It was visual. We did group work, round robin, individual, and the whole way. He wasn't really teaching, but we were discovering.
Yeah, he basically ran the gamut, right? Like that is, to your point, Andy, even if you want to understand a master facilitator work, right? Someone who's run a course, who knows the material cold, but understands how to keep you engaged. I mean, let's be honest here. It's 3 days, and we started at 8:30 every day, and we went till 6 p.m. every night.
Sharp. Each day it was on the dot, both ends of the time box.
And it was by about 10 o'clock, at one point he brings up that Far Side cartoon with the character with the really small head says, "Excuse me, can I be excused? My brain is full." I felt like that at about 10:30 a.m. on the second day, right? Because it was so much, and not that it was in a bad way, but it was just every time he would say something, right? And again, I'm going to go back to my safe experience. I would listen to what he said, and I would stop back, and I would go, "Well, what the fuck am I doing at my day job?" Right? Like, what am I doing here? And that constant, like you said, the in and the out, the solo work, the teamwork at the board, then the conversation where we learned for ourselves by him talking us through it. It was like, there was so much. I went back and I looked at all my notes, and I got flags, I got highlights, I got pictures of my slides. I got to take them to work. I really took it was a lot. It was a lot, but it was brilliantly run to the point where at my 2-hour drive home, I really just tried to decompress, and I thought it's probably one of the best courses I've ever taken. Even if I never used LeSS as a practice, just the learnings was unreal. How about you, Chris?
Oh, I totally agree. It was super intense. 3 days of nonstop, and he's very, very precise. We had 11-minute breaks, a 37-minute lunch. So it is, and he kept us going. But he's got a very a really good way of speaking. It just seems like a real gentle way of bringing you in. And even during the breaks, just trying to change it. And he would have music, and he would have the photographs running in the background. So your brain wasn't constantly on, so that you came back from break and you could absorb a little bit more.
Yeah.
I looked at the number of slides he had, 657 slides.
Wow. In 3 days.
Yeah.
In 3 days.
Yeah, that's a lot. So Chris, you talked about the causal loop diagrams, and for our listeners, you can look it up. I think it was an MIT practice. It is similar if you've done CDEs, containers, differences, exchanges. It looks at the interactions of elements of a system. Chris, you had an intro to that before. You wanted to help us unpack for our listeners a little more about this drawing things out visually through these causal loops, and how it helped you make sense of some of the things that Craig was passing on to us.
Sure, I can try. He had presented the exercises to us as puzzles. So when he brought them to us, he said, here are the variables you should consider. And what we needed to do in the course was connect the variables. How does one variable affect another? Is one variable have a direct correlation or an indirect correlation, or maybe no relationship at all with one another? And so just being able to do that with a group of folks with different perspectives, I think really helped me process how having multiple backlogs, for example, would affect us all working on the highest priority items for our customer. So it's how are all of these sort of variables correlated? And so the course, we went through a number of those exercises, and I think the diagrams ended up taking a good part of those walls, and those were pretty big walls.
Jay, what did you take from the causal loop diagrams and that systems thinking approach?
So I will say that I had never heard of one of those before. I had never seen one of those before. So this was completely brand new to me. Like I literally, Andy, you just referenced what CDEs. I'd never even heard of that either, right? I made a note to myself. I got to look that up later. So the idea of this exercise was completely new. And at first, obviously, you're a little bit worried about getting the syntax right. Like, does this arrow, where's the zero go? Is there a break? Is it strong? Is it weak? But once we got, I'd say like by the second or third exercise, I started just cognitively, it made sense. And I thought that was like Chris said, the way it's presented as a game almost, as a scenario that you have to talk yourself through. And well, is this impact this, or does this impact that? And what happens when this goes up? Does this goes down? I mean, I loved it. Like I just ordered a book off Amazon on systems thinking, systems diagramming, causal loop diagrams, all that sort of stuff from MIT, because I found that really fascinating because it's fairly elegant. And it when you understand how to read it, it makes everything look very simple. I'll give a shout out to the guy. I'm not sure of his last name, Lee something or other. He blogs about less. He's an English as a second language guy, so truth be told, sometimes it is very difficult to read. But he had these things all over the place explaining how there's only one backlog you want. And I'm looking at these diagrams and going, what the fuck is this thing? Like, I don't even know what I'm looking at. After taking the class, I went back and read his blog post and I went, okay, now
Makes
I get
sense.
that. Now I get that. Now I get that. Yeah, I really loved it. It's a very elegant way to think yourself through a complex scenario.
One of the things that amazed me about these puzzles is when he'd present it, the gut answer was usually wrong, right? All right, well, how do you, optimize for output? Well, you have separate backgrounds so everybody can prioritize, and the teams. And then when you begin to work it out, he described it as working things out slowly and using that part of your brain instead of the fast cognitive bias part of the brain. And that to me was really powerful.
Yeah, he called out Andy. Didn't he call out like Daniel Kahneman? I think he calls out the book. And that's how, he said, you can't sum this course up in a PowerPoint. Whenever someone asks me now what that course was like, I said, it's two things. It's causal loop diagrams and it's Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. And they look at me and they go, what? How does that? I'm like, just take the course, man. Just take the course.
Right. And only by having multiple viewpoints, it was just fascinating. Because if we solve the problem ourselves with our cognitive biases, it's like, no, of course you have separate lists because that's what I've got and it works fine. And the point that leads to what he described over and over again was local optimization, right? Yet organizations keep doing that. They keep optimizing locally. They keep having these self-inflicted wounds and missing um, faster looped learning opportunities. Um, and so, going through one or two, it made so much sense. But I can see how doing it in words makes it really hard.
Mm.
Doing it visually makes it so clear.
And he also reminded us several times is that you can't take your work and show it to someone else because they
Mhm.
have to go through that cognitive process to really understand how the variables and how these items fit together to make the whole system.
You're right. You're right. And that's why you can't just, to your point, I did have someone ask me, what did your causal loop diagram look like? And I texted him the picture and he goes, well, what the hell is this? I said, I could have sent you Sanskrit. You would have had the same remark, right? Because you don't understand it. Chris, very good point. You need to walk through it to understand what you're actually looking at, to understand the knowledge that's contained therein.
Well, at the end of day 3, Chris, as you said, it was not a small diagram. It was from floor level to as high as we could write, and it was a good 8 to 10 feet wide
Easily, yeah.
of various variables and elements of a complex system. With mostly the goal was what was the plot? Increasing adaptability, right? For
Yes.
being agile, but we did our best to avoid that A word, but just said, the organizational goal is to increase adaptability, meaning faster learning cycles, lower transaction costs, right? Identifying where the waste was in the system so you could reduce it.
That's an interesting point, Andy, when you said increase adaptability, right? Because he gave the whole history of Jim Highsmith and adaptive versus agile. I actually kept a tick mark counter in my book. The first day he used the word agile twice, and he used the word less once in the whole entire first day. And I went home and I thought to myself, and when I was trying to explain it to somebody else, I said, that's actually super impressive because, he goes back to that one remark he made, don't lose the plot, right? Don't get off what you're really trying to achieve. The fact that he taught an entire course and barely used the A word, I was really impressed by that. And he really only said less on the third day when he talked about large less, or what's it called, global less, the big one.
Huge.
Huge.
Less huge. That's the only time he really used that word, which really made you think like he wasn't teaching us less. He was teaching us, like you said, system optimization, don't forsake local optimization, all that sort of stuff, which I thought was like, while I've used don't lose the plot in like 7 meetings since that class. I use
People
it all
just
the
want to
time.
smack you. He was, he wasn't teaching less, but more important, he wasn't selling less
Mm-hmm.
as the silver bullet to solve every problem out there in terms of organizational adaptiveness, which I thought was a good message and refreshing in this day and age.
So speaking of in that first day, right? So if you're following along at home, so far we've been told we can't tell this course to anybody else. We can't do PowerPoint, right? We've used causal loop diagrams. We're talking about system thinking. We're not using the word agile. We're not using the word less, right? This is 2 hours into our first of 3 days. I think another turning point for me, epiphany, was when he said less isn't a scaling framework. It's an organizational design tool.
Mm.
And I never, Discipline Agile has said we're not a scaling framework, we're a toolkit of agile practices, which I can agree. But hearing him say that, I never heard less referred to that way before. And then as we finished the 3 days, I'm like, oh shit, he's right. Like he's really trying to get to, if you don't lose the plot, to go back, I'm going to keep using that. I'm going to beat that fucker to death. As long as if you keep going back to that main message, it is all about organizational design.
And that's incredibly difficult when you're at scale, or even if you're small, because you've got established roles, structures, hierarchies, teams, product lines, and you're asking people, and when they think fast, they're like, this all works fine, but when you work it all out, you can show them through these causal loop diagrams, these system analyses, that there's a huge amount of waste and impedance and transaction costs and all that stuff. And and that's probably another reason why you can't just go and take it home in the same way that you can go off to a Scrum class and say, great, here's how we now implement Scrum, or here's how we're going to do SAFe, or here's how we're going to do blah, 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 XP or mobbing. It's not that easy.
No.
Well, and you have to also consider, I think, when you're looking at all of this, what is the ultimate goal, right? So we did talk a lot about what is the optimization goal for the organization. Is it adaptiveness? Maybe it's not. Maybe the organizational's optimization goal is something like keeping people employed, giving people jobs. So that's a valid goal. So I think the important thing is to remember when you're doing those diagrams to really understand what your goal is as an organization, and executive leadership needs to decide on that strategy.
He brought up an interesting headline from the summer of 2019 about Amazon investing in 100,000, 1/3 of its workforce, approximately $7,000 or $8,000 per person in the next 6 years to retrain its workforce. And so maybe that, Chris, comes back to the plot of let's keep these people, right? Because other organizations could have been, well, great, we just need to get rid of, we need to do a reduction in force of 1/3 of our headcount. But in Amazon's case, it was no. We need to help 1/3, 100,000 people learn to do something different in terms of roles, responsibilities. I don't know with the makeup of the workforce that they're training, whether it is warehouse fulfillment people that are being made redundant by automation. I don't know if they're moving them into software development or customer service. I'm not really sure, but wow, talk about a big plot, right? Repurpose 1/3 of your workforce through training.
And if you think about it, that's so thinking fast and slow, right? Your knee-jerk reaction is, my God, that's got to be terrible, right? Like think about all the money. Some bean counter somewhere will hear this and say, well, think about all the money we have to spend now with training and certification and classes and this is that. But if you think about it, if you're basically retooling your workforce, they already understand the culture. They already understand who the players are. They know where the bathrooms are. They know where the cafeteria is. They get that. Like that.
I love your priorities, Jay.
Well, I mean, let's think about it. They understand the organizational gestalt without having to read it, right? Like read a manual and follow some instructional. So the knee-jerk reaction would say that's a terrible idea. But when you think about it logically and walk yourself through it, you're like, well, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the line that Craig used is they offered job security, not role security.
Right.
Which I think that's a really powerful statement to imagine, like the head of a company going through a change, right? It's getting up and saying, I am not going to offer role security, but I'll offer job security. Right there, that takes everyone's concerns right off the table. Because that's what we go to as people. It's the first thing we're worried about. How am I going to pay my mortgage?
Yeah. I like that. And so how do you bring that to organizational change as you are competing with so many companies that just want a simple formula? We want the Spotify model. We want the Google way. We want to just install this. Can't you make us lean? Can't you make us agile? So much of our industry is headed in that direction.
So to that point, as I'm sitting here laughing, as I'm making jokes saying, what the fuck am I doing in my day job, right? Like I sell fake change. I'm a fraud, right? After taking this course, I understand why SAFe is as big as it is. Not to speak ill of SAFe, right? But I understand why. Craig made the remark that, unless an organization is aligned against a product. If they sell a service, not a product, it's very hard to enact lasting cultural change. Was something something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about how, if there's no burning desire to change, it's not going to stick. Well, not to insult scaled agile, but there's a lot of, let's put it this way, divorce the framework itself and the practices prescribed therein from the consultants. The consultants tell you, oh, we can make you agile with safe. And all they're really doing is like that meme where the guy slaps the bucket of water is draining and he slaps the plastic thing on it and then the water stops draining. It's that meme from the infomercial.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically an agile consultant saying, oh, you want agile, Chris? Okay, whap. And they throw the safe patch on it. And going through this course, that was another thing that I took back was I understand why some of those bigger, more prescriptive type of frameworks have probably a bigger market share because they don't require the true upheaval that is really necessary to really transform. That's my 2 cents.
And they appeal to our cognitive bias, right? Give me an instruction manual. I don't want to have to think about all of this because, our leaders and executives are really busy people and they're thinking about a lot of things already. And this is just another thing, if they can outsource it, why not outsource it? So I'm not saying that it's easier, but in a way it is.
Yeah.
I read something, and I'll put the link in the show notes. That was great. Jim Benson had a post, Lean and Agile fail because we teach Lean and Agile. And he went on to talk about Spike Lee, talking about yelling into the camera, it's the shoes, for his Air Jordan ads. And then Jim goes on to write, it was never the shoes, right? It wasn't, Michael and Magic and LeBron, they could have played in golf cleats, right? And they would have run circles. Yet, we're selling shoes, right? If you just put on the safe shoes, the Scrum shoes, the Kanban shoes, you'll be fine. The team's going to play fine. I don't know if this is cargo culting yet again. Without changing the underlying optimization priorities. Towards I don't remember the days and at what point, but at some point Craig did a very satirized approach of change management, where he drew a causal loop and the roles of the traditional waterfall, and then he just slapped new titles and the causal loops were the same, and suddenly it was some other scaling type, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are we falling victim to that? And is that what you said, Chris? People are comfortable with it because when you think fast, it's like, yep, great. I don't have to change accounting. I don't have to change HR. Things are just going to work. And lo and behold, we're going to go lockstep. And every 6 weeks, we're going to, ship something out the train and bada boom, bada bing. How's that working out for us? What percentage succeed? What percentage fail?
I am very curious, and this bootstraps into an episode you probably listeners will hear before this, where we talked about the future of Agile, where I think that we're entering a very interesting place, being as we're hitting the 20-year mark, so we're due for a disruption, right? If history is any indication. Someone seemed to have just listened to this and was screaming, but you can't use the past to predict the future. However, things do. Nature is very cyclical, and I think we're reaching that inflection point where maybe less really is the future, because when you encounter that burning desire to change, it forces you to make those tough decisions that you can't just slap the Flex Seal sticker on it on your org with safe on the side and hope it works.
Yeah, and well, you can't install less either.
No, that was the other thing that was interesting to hear him say. We're doing a, what did he say? Somebody said, I don't want to pick on her, I think it was Rachel said, we're doing a grassroots less adoption. And he, with it, really, just looked at her and said, yeah, that's not going to work.
Well, he said that to us a lot, to be fair.
Very true. Very true.
We wanted to try all kinds of things. But I mean, ultimately, it comes down to changing the system to change the behavior to get different results, right? I mean, that's why LeSS is an organizational design change, because that's what's really going to change your system.
Yes.
Yep.
And but we all want instant pudding. right? And as Deming taught us, there is no instant pudding.
I think that's also a Larman quote where I think it's him, it's one of Larman's laws, right? Culture follows structure. So if you build the right structure, your culture will follow. I think that's one of the things that he said. That sounds like something I would say.
Sounds about right. So one of the big things that came out of the causal loop diagrams are all the problems that come when you try to optimize locally without looking at the system. And how it became so clear through these puzzles, as you described them, Chris, that when we focus on the wrong parts, or we optimize the subsystem, we degrade the entire system, and we start losing the plot. What were some of the what were some of the learnings that really stuck out for you guys around local optimization?
I'll go first, Chris, if you don't mind. The thing that sticks in my mind when I think of local optimization is backlogs. And each team has their own backlog. And then for if you're in a safe shop, a train has its own program backlog. And then there's a portfolio backlog. And that is, you're optimizing each team. You're basically optimizing each team for resource efficiency, right? They're always keeping busy by working on what they think is the most important thing. However, in the aggregate, overarchingly for the company, Jay's team may be working on, Chris may be working on what is number one and number two for the company-wide priority. I may have 371 and 372 because we have that many teams. But to me, it's the number one and number two. But we lost the plot as far as organizationally was that what we're trying to get to. And to me, that was a big eye opener for me.
What about you, Chris?
So when I think of local optimization, I'm thinking about how fast an individual team is going, right? How efficient is that one individual team? How productive is that one individual team? But if that one team is super fast and all of the other teams are, not quite as fast, or the integration points between all of those teams are broken, then ultimately we're broken at the system level. And so local optimization, while really nice, is a secondary concern. So when you're looking at the overall system, you want to really take a look at what your system optimization goal is. And if your local optimization goal is inconsistent with that, then you're not getting the benefits of optimizing the entire system as a unit.
Yeah. One of the things that continues to stand out for me from those causal loop diagrams is the impact of component versus feature teams, specialist roles, and how, again, thinking fast, you're like, of course that's a better way, until you map it out and you realize, well, when you do that, you build up inventory and queues and handoffs and scatter the information and introduce defects into the system. And as you both have said, when you look at the whole, you're making a real big mess.
And so I'm gonna launch off of that. You talked about, it just makes sense. We'll stand up all these component teams, and then you have all those handoffs, you have all those delay, you have waste in the system. The remark that Craig made, which is the difference between a trade-off and a constraint, I have used that numerous times, where he talks about, is it truly a trade-off or is it a constraint? If it's a constraint, you solve for the constraint. He said 9 times out of 10, we call something a trade-off because it's a constraint that we don't want to acknowledge. And then he went to the whole, in a trade-off, you do lawyer's rules and you make both sides equally miserable. Right? I thought that was super powerful, because when I went back to my day job, I started paying attention to the conversations we were having, and anytime the word trade-off was used, and I think I actually kept a running tick mark on a post-it somewhere upstairs. I'm going to go off the cuff and say about 80% of the time we were using the term trade-off to describe a constraint that was either too big for us to tackle, or it required way more thought than we were willing to give. It was a personnel related, where it was too much of a sticky wicket that we didn't want to go anywhere near, or it was an almost insurmountable problem due to culture, right? Organizational, what did Greg call it? Not tech debt, but organizational debt. Another one of those things. So after that class, I've started to listen, and 8 times out of 10, I can prove we use the term trade-off to hide the constraint we don't want to acknowledge.
You gave some good examples of organizational redesign that helped companies avoid some of that. Well, that's just the way it is. And one that stands out for me was the BMW self-driving car, how they created a new physical facility. So they built a parallel organization, separate and self-contained, that had all the skills necessary, and small, the 2 pizza teams that had clear focus. And that's not always possible because we're working in fixed facilities with existing teams, existing hierarchies. I wonder, so you've brought back a focus on language as one thing to identify the real thing. For either of you, it's just a toss-up. What do you bring back and help the groups that you're working with begin to see the system as a whole rather than the local that they're so beautifully focused on?
After you, Chris.
Oh, I think it's a hard one.
That was a tap. That was a tap over to Chris. How do you help these people not lose the plot? I mean, that's a powerful phrase. Don't lose the plot.
Well, I think you have to have a plot in the first place. And a lot of us don't. I think, my perspective might be think about the system, but Igor's perspective might be think about our individual team. And so without that direction from our leaders, almost top down, we care more about adaptivity more than we care about local optimization. Then we just have to try and chip away at it, I think, a little bit at a time, asking questions, providing examples, maybe playing some games. It feels a lot like game theory, some of this. So maybe playing some games in game theory. And so really that's all I've been doing. And I think that over time, saying similar things over and over, people start to repeat that and people start to internalize that. But I think, those activities are really important.
I like that. Have either of you begun to see the incentive systems, possibly the perverse incentive systems, that keep the status quo, that keep local optimization at an elevated level?
So I'll go first on this one, Chris. So I had an interesting experience in the last couple weeks. I had an interesting conversation, which actually is relevant to this. So right after I took this course, I ended up taking the Scaled Agile Lean Portfolio Management course, the LPM course, which is all about setting up your portfolio and all that sort of stuff. And another episode coming up with Troy. And we talked about incentives, and one of the things we talked about was the idea of funding teams over funding projects or programs, right? Like you need to fund the team. Craig goes into, I think he calls like expense accounting, where you just look at your current run rate and that's what you budget forward. So funnily enough, in my class was the head of finance, IT finance. So this is the guy who picks the budgets for everything. Like he's the one who, when IT or whatever gets their piece of the pie from the corporate, mucky mucks, he's the one who divvies it up. And he made a remark. He goes, I don't understand why there's such confusion with this. We don't fund projects anymore. We just fund teams. And a whole like record scratch. And everybody stopped. We're a class of 20 people. We all turned to him and we went, well, what? And he said, well, we've been doing this now for a year. We just fund your teams, or we fund your, in the safe parlance, we fund trains. We're not funding projects or programs. So to your point, Andy, where we lost the plot, we realized that the breakdown was that message wasn't permeating that giant frozen middle, which Craig talked to a lot. So there were people who were still looking at, Chris is calling up and saying, well, what clarity code do I use for this project? Because I'm worried about, where do I associate my time? So talk about perverse incentives, where it was either we couldn't figure out, we didn't have enough time to unpack it. We couldn't figure out, was it the message not getting through? Was it people, it was going in one ear and going out the other and it wasn't resonating, or were they not getting it? But talking about perverse incentives, we had people who were still trying to work, for lack of a better term, the old way. And that was eye-opening for everyone in the class, because we all walked around and said, well, if we get it, and the guy who's actually handing out, at the family reunion, when you walk by your grandfather, he gives all the grandkids a $20 bill, right? If grandpa's handing out the 20s, what's getting in the way here? And that was it actually dovetailed into a different conversation that's being had at different levels now with a lot of the problems we're starting to think are coming back down to communication. That's a hypothesis we have. It's poor communication, not resonating through the right levels. I hope I didn't just take us off on some weird tangent.
You always take us off on a weird tangent, and it's always so much fun. And then we'll tie it back somehow. Chris?
Well, I think the budgeting one is a big one, right? And Craig talked about the book Beyond Budgeting. I have not read this. I don't know if you guys have read that. And Peter Merrill talks about throughput accounting, which I'm trying to learn more about as well, which I think maybe can help us get off of the whole siloed, this is how much I have allocated for my department. I mean, we're all one organization, right? And trying to do the best thing for our customers. So getting away from that can help. And in terms of the metrics that we look at, why are companies still looking at velocity as a measure of performance, right? I think that is also hurting us. Those sort of, what are the Scrum metrics that we should be looking at in order to evaluate how productive our teams are, right? Rather than looking at what are we really providing to our customers.
CJ, you brought us around. So a big piece of that, I think, is a misguided idea that you talk about velocity. Why are we measuring velocity? Well, we want to be able to have our Scrum teams commit to when they're going to be done. And now we're doing meeting waterfalls, right? And people forget that value statement of the manifesto, right? That talks about customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And in the class, Craig made a point to say that that contract is internal contracts between the stakeholders or the customer and the makers, the developers. So why do we use velocity in such a perverse way? Because we have bastardized the scope of the sprint into thinking, well, there's a scope commitment. You've committed to those stories and you have a velocity, and therefore we're going to measure you against that. And that's a measure of the maturity, the quality, the commitment, blah, 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 blah. When in fact, if you do a causal loop diagram and you have scope commitment as a variable, and you have quality and learning, improving tech debt, org debt, you kind of see the reality of the perversity that comes with using velocity as a measure of anything of meaning outside of a local consideration. You know, Jay, you had talked about org debt, right? We didn't talk about tech debt. Tech debt tends to be relatively easy to fix if you have the time. Org debt, I don't know about you guys, but I have been in a number of places where retention, motivation, incentive has tanked, and the amount of time is measured in years to repair that debt, right, at the organizational level.
Yeah, it's once bitten, twice shy. So, and Craig kept making the joke, like, I have seen 7 management fads in my career, right? Like he's, and if I think backwards, okay, so strict waterfall via PMI is definitely one of them. TQM was definitely one of them. Business process management and engineering was definitely one of them, right? So when you think backwards, it's like, okay, so think about that constant change. If change is the only constant, the idea of organizational elasticity and how much can people absorb before that rubber band just gets stretched to the point of breaking. And that's where trying to unwind organizational debt gets very hairy, because you've almost reached, you've crossed the Rubicon and you've realized we can't go back. We have to burn I'm going to mix metaphors here. We've landed in a new world. We're burning the boats and we're moving on, right? And when you have that realization and you've realized that, and then you look back and I see Andy who's still on the boat, like waving as the flames are rising. It's like, how do you convince Andy that, you got to get off the boat? You got to get off the boat and you're going to have a whole new hairdo and it's not going to be a good look. Yeah, the org debt stuff is so fascinating because it takes so long to unwind, because at that point you're not talking about technical widgets, you're talking about culture, and that's where it's oof.
And organizational memory, like you're saying, organizational memory is really long.
Yeah. Especially, right, Chris, especially if you're in a place where maybe the tenure of people is longer, like bigger, larger established companies, who have people celebrate their 35, 40, 45, 50 years with the company, right? Like they remember probably management fads going back to, the dawn of time.
Right. Here's another flavor for you guys. Okay. What do you want? Just tell me what to do. I think that's how we get into those scenarios. Just tell me what you want me to do.
Yeah, you're right. And that's where that prescription comes in, because they're so burnt. Just give me the playbook. And he made a remark about that. Like, if you have a playbook, you're screwed. Or if you have a COE, your company has way too much money. Like, they're wasting way too much money. Like, painful one-liners that he threw out. That was another for anyone who's worried about, thinking about taking the course. He threw out a lot of one-liners that really made you think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another one-liner that sticks with me is, it's not about what you add, it's about what you take away. Right? It's not about scaling to deal with complexity. It's about descaling and simplifying. And the constant theme was, what can we delete? And it was simple things like multiple backlogs, right? Multiple prioritized lists, multiple roles, multiple titles. And it wasn't, how can we apply Agile at scale? Is how can we reduce the scale? How can we simplify it? There's so many examples of people attempting to scale in complexity, and one of them that we're all familiar with was healthcare.gov, and Larman brought it up in the class. Build round one was over 50 different contracting firms, thousands of team members, $250,000, and we all know how that launched. The fix was a 2-pizza team, right? And $4 million, and a rebuild. And I don't know if that's the solution. I don't think it is for everything, but it's certainly a fascinating look of, what do we need to add? No. What can we take away and still not lose the plot?
Right. That's where the whole idea of descaling finally clicked. Chris mentioned Peter Merrill. I read all this stuff. Like, I think he's nuts, but I love what he says. And he's another guy banging the descaling drum. And it's very hard to conceptualize what that actually means until you walk through. I think this class is what sealed it for me, because walking through that causal loop diagram, I understand how when you add those layers of layers of layers of layers, how you lose the plot of adaptiveness. One backlog to rule them all, right? Like, the concept of descaling for me personally after this class, now I can explain it in a way to say, like you said, Andy, it's not what you add, it's what you take away. Take the stupid and the local optimization out of the system.
One of the concepts that I'm still struggling with is about product definition, making it as broad as possible. I'm still having bias issues with that. Did that unlock anything in either of you? Were you able to wrap your mind around it? Because we talk about Microsoft Office as an example, right? And to me, my biases are, no, of course you have different teams to build the spreadsheet, the processor, the database, the slideshow. Of course you have separate teams. But every time we would do a causal loop on it, it came back to, no, it's one product. Microsoft Office.
That
doesn't make sense to me.
that was a tough part of the exercise. I remember that I think Andy, we were still in the same group together on the other side of the room. That was, Craig kept coming back and having to explain it again and again because we were having a real tough time. I still trouble wrapping my head around it. But there was some, funnily enough, here I am scrolling through my notes, and one of the notes I took down was, he said, in the long term, product complexity is almost meaningless in regards to adaptiveness. So if the plot, right, if your primary, the primary objective, prime directive is adaptability, then you don't have to worry about the product being so complex. But to your point, Chris, the company needs to know what their prime directive is. Like, what's your goal here? But you're right, Andy. That was a tough mental thing to break for me, especially.
I thought it was at first as well, until we started talking about, well, if you've got multiple products, then you have more backlogs, and then you've got more handoffs, and so then you've got more optimization. And I work for a medium-sized organization, so maybe it's a little bit easier for me to vision all of our products as one big product. And I'm often thinking, well, why are we working on so many different priorities? Our customers want to see delivery, right? They want to see improvements in our systems. Why aren't we all working on that highest priority and learning from each other? And yeah, there's a transitional cost. We're going to need to have our teams get trained up on the different products or requirement areas that all become one, right? There's some cost there. There's some learning cost at first, but the payoff is huge at the end of the day. So, I mean, to me, it makes a little bit more intuitive sense, just because let's just all work on the highest priority together, and then, go down the list, then get to the next highest priority.
In a shared code base.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
God, that is such a change for so many organizations.
To that point, Andy. Another thing, if people are thinking about taking this course, you really do need to know Scrum as the way it was written. Like, you need to understand Scrum, the guide. There were a couple times people would ask questions, and Craig would make this like perplexed look, and he goes, "That's a Scrum question. That's not a LeSS question." And the person would be like, he really does bang that drum really hard about, everything is around the baseline of Scrum, which is elegant in its simplicity. And that was one thing you really do need to brush up on, is you need to make sure your Scrum is tight, because Andy and I, Chris, were joking. We were passing our test scores back and forth, and I barely passed the first practice test. And he's like, "Dude, what are you doing over there? Are you coaching?" I'm like,
and you're a Scrum trainer.
Jeez. Yeah.
So we're coming up on the time box. We'll go round robin. Another one-liner or a great thought that either of you took away from the class. What do you got?
I'm here looking through my notes. I mean, well, we keep saying that one, don't lose the plot. So when we first did our causal loop diagram, there's 4 remarks that Craig made us put up on the screen, and I actually wrote them on the back of my book. His first remark was, in every step of the way, don't lose the plot. So remember where you're backing up to. He said, don't denigrate. Bootstrapping on top of that, move beyond the false dichotomy, right? It's never a simple, black or white. There's always more there. And his quote of, "It's not wrong, it's just inconsistent with the goal of whatever." And that, especially if you're used to telling people that, well, you're doing that wrong, which truth be told, I've seen coaches do. That's not what you should say. Craig beat it into my head. It's not that what you're doing is wrong, Jay. It's just that the results you will get are incongruent with what we're really trying to achieve. And that just keeps bouncing around in my head. That, and I'm going to call it right now, meat widgets. I have used the meat widgets. I used it in my Safe LPM class because, again, the guy in finance IT, and he's like, well, when we do contract negotiations with Andy Cleff Inc., and he's a master service agreement, and we pull a bucket of resources. And I cut him off and I went, what? He goes, a bucket of resources. I mean, what do you mean resources? He goes, well, developers, testers. I said, hold on. Don't call them resources. That's insulting, right? If you're going to call them anything, call them meat widgets. And he got speechless. Everybody else in the class laughed. I had the whole rest of the class using meat widgets. So we do, Chris, you'll enjoy this. I I texted some guy to do clip art of a meat widget. We're going to do stickers. I just got to get the final
Yes.
touches. You
I'm
got to
pretty excited about that.
send me your address. I'll send them over to you. But yeah, that was the other thing, meat widget, right? You talk about language. That word, when you stop calling people resources and call them meat widgets, it's even more degrading to make you stop and think like, hey. Simon Sinek, that they're not head count, they're heartbeats, right? And that's the thing that stuck out of me. It's a lot of the times the words that we use, analogies or anagrams or they're proxies for dealing with the truth behind that. And I think that you stop calling them resources or meat widgets, you realize that it's a person and it creates a different way of interaction.
I like that. Chris, one key takeaway.
So I would say just look at the basics. Really understand if your organization does have a unified optimization goal. Because without that, there are a lot of conflicts that just won't be resolved because you've got different goals in the organization. And second, understand that there is a system to evaluate. It's not just a bunch of teams working in isolation. There's always a system, and finding out where those integration points is really important if you want to help the system grow.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, for the managers in the middle that are wondering what their role is in this new world, focus on improving the system, not local optimization. Give up, 100% utilization of your meat widgets. Give up looking at velocity. Look at the whole system and understand the interconnectedness of it all. Well, thanks again to both of you, Jay and Chris, and to our listening audience. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a rating. It helps other people find us. If this is your first time tuning in, subscribe. If you'd like to join the discussion, share your stories about what you can remove from the system, as long as you don't touch the craft beer supply. Join us at coalition.agileuprising.com. And finally, support from listeners just like you help us cover our hosting and podcast. Our hosting and production costs, yes. See, we have to pay for that to be handled in post-production, so you don't hear that loss. See the show notes, and you can become a patron. And for as little as $5 a month, we'll send you a batch of our latest stickers, including the great, soon-to-be in production meat widget.
Meat widget. I am not a meat widget, or I'm not a resource. Yep.
I'm not a resource. Call me by my name. Cheers, everybody.
Got started in children with like a syringe full of AIDS and blood.